This is a lecture from Open Tuition. For the free lecture notes that go with this podcast, please visit opentuition.com.
Risk reduction, diversification. One way of reducing risk is to spread our activities over a greater area. Auditors would do this, not in the US. Oh yeah, okay, even in the US. They will have separate departments for the corporate recovery department, internal audit department, the secretarial department, trust department, where they do work acting as trustees for clients who want to leave their trust property in the hands of someone that they can put their faith in. And so audit, certainly the audit firm I grew up with, they had a trust department, and they administered the trust. They were given power over the property in order to look after that property until the beneficiary had reached the appropriate age. So the audit firms will diversify in order to minimize the risk of the impact, of a severe impact of losing a lot of audit clients. Then they'll have a lot of accountancy work instead. Some audit firms may say, well, although we're trying to concentrate and focus on only large audits, would it not be sensible to have a small audits department, a department for small audits rather than a small audit department, a department for small audits, and that will diversify the risk of losing one of your major clients. You've got some small audit jobs which are still generating bread and butter income. So one way of reducing is to spread the entity's activities over a greater range, geographical range, product range, target market, aiming for different groups of customers. In this way, poor performance in one sector could be counterbalanced by good performance in another. There was an audit question at P7 level of a couple of brothers who started a bus company. And the bus company was doing very well. It was based on an actual situation in the UK. And the bus company was doing very well. And then an opportunity came the way of these two brothers that they could buy a nursing home where old people get sent by the children. You'll do this to your parents. You'll send them off to a nursing home when they get old, and they will be looked after. And although it sounds cruel to send your mum and your dad off like that, then your children will do the same to you when you're of a certain age. They'll say, Mum, it's time you left, it's time you went into this nursing home. And these two brothers, they're running a bus company very successfully. They now decided to buy and operate a nursing home. Risk? There's diversification, you're spreading the risk. But what about the risk of, we have no experience of nursing homes? They just don't know what to do. So presumably they'll get all these old people and put them in a bus and just drive them up and down the motorway all day, just to keep them amused. So we can diversify, and in one way, this way, poor performance in one sector could well be counterbalanced by good performance in another, but it's got to be proper diversification. It's no good saying I'm going to diversify, I'm no longer going to sell just to Libya, I'm going to sell to Libya and Algeria. Well, the risk is the same. You're, with apologies to anyone in Libya or Algeria, you're selling to an unstable governmental country, and you're facing exchange rate risks the same as you would. So you're not really diversifying at all. How could John diversify? He asked me to ask you. He doesn't know. How can he do that? How can he diversify? Well, he can't really. And it's not a well, I suppose maybe if he started to run courses, for instance, for CIMA or for CFA, that would be diversification. And then if ACCA became unpopular, heaven forbid, but if ACCA did become unpopular, then John would have an alternative source of income teaching other courses. He could come and work here, for instance. He could, and he has been asked, will you run some courses here? And he says, the last thing I want to do in my life is start working for 2 hours a night at some business school. So that would be a possible diversification for him. Okay, risk avoidance and retention. The expression risk avoidance means a strategy by which an entity literally avoids risk. Whereas risk retention is the strategy by which the company chooses to retain the risk within the entity. These are all part, these are both part of our friend, aren't they? Who's our friend? What's her name? Risk avoidance, risk retention. What's her name? Tara. Transfer. Accept. Reduce and avoid. Yeah. So there you've got risk avoidance and risk retention. Both expressions are indicators of the entity's appetite for risk. Appetite. Are you cautious or are you avaricious? Do you like risk? Do you get excited and thrive on risk? Is your life? No, you don't. Are you also boring? Are you a risk taker or not? No. No.
I think if you ask that question to some group of sales managers, then they sound so big.
If you asked to sales managers, you'd say that they were risk takers. Funnily enough, I would suggest that the female half of the population tend to be more risk averse than the male half, possibly because the female half actually think things through a lot more deeply than the men. Men just see an opportunity and go for it, whereas women will say, and maybe then don't accept or are not as avaricious for risk as men are. That may be an unfair generalization. It's just my impression. For example, we're coming down page 87. An entity may choose to accept the risk of exchange rate movements of the euro, believing them to be probably insignificant, although that would be a bad choice now, wouldn't it? The euro's fallen, hasn't it? Oh no, the pound has fallen against the euro. Yeah, the pound has fallen against the euro. So you may choose to accept the risk of exchange rate movement, but would you really want to take the same risk if the currency contract was in Uzbekistan, in the Soom? Because such exchange, when I first went to Uzbekistan, the exchange rate, I seem to remember, the exchange rate was about 1,200 Soom to the pound. And I last went to Uzbekistan about 3 years later, and by then it was 2,800 Soom to the pound. And the biggest currency denomination that they had, that I was aware of, the biggest currency denomination was 200 Soom, which was about, in your currency, it was about 14 cents. And if you ever wanted to buy even a beer, if you wanted to buy a beer in Uzbek, you had to take this vast pile of money out of your pocket and start counting 20, 40, 60. And you're paying like 800 Soom, or even more than that, maybe 1,000. The biggest currency note that they had was 200. And I've got one currency note for 1 Soom. I mean, how much is that worth? And it's a piece that the paper is worth more than the amount that it's involved in. So you may probably not accept the currency risk for highly volatile currencies. Risk avoidance attitude is determined by a combination of strategy, capacity, and appetite. The strategy, do we want to go down this risky road? Can we afford to go down this risky road? And do we want to? Do we feel that it will be a good move because it's going to generate higher profits? So our appetite will be affected. The overall strategy then determines the overall approach. Capacity indicates how much we can accept, and appetite determines the way in which the risks will be managed. Need. There's always a need for risk. Everything you do. The moment you get out of bed in the morning, you start facing risks on a daily basis. It's embedded within your life. It's embedded within your culture. You take risks. The only way not to is to stay in bed all day. And even then, some would say that you then face a risk. The risk of becoming bedbound. The risk that your muscles atrophy and that you don't get exercise, and if you're staying in bed all day, presumably you don't get food either. So as soon as you get out, you start facing risks. Accepting risk can give an entity a competitive advantage, and some would say that the more we accept, the better we are, the more likely we are to gain on our competitors. So the greater your risk appetite and the greater your acceptance of risk, possibly, arguably, the stronger you are on a relative comparative basis. Equally, companies which are not prepared to accept will lose a competitive advantage to others that do accept. And the greater the risk, as a general principle, the greater the risk, the greater the rewards. Do you remember we had the earlier example about two companies, one who was expanding by acquisition, the other was expanding organically. The one expanding by acquisition is likely to grow faster, but they take a greater risk. And finally, the benefits don't need to be financial. The greater the risk, the greater the returns tend to be higher on riskier products. The benefits don't need to be financial. They can also involve better quality information. If I take a risk, if I invest heavily in machinery and systems, that's a risk I face. But the payoff is that the information I get is better, quicker. Oh, it's better, it's quicker. Now those two were two characteristics which we didn't have in our list of good information characteristics. I don't think we had better and quicker, did we? No, because there was no B's and there were no Q's, but there were two A's, weren't there? What were the two A's?
Accurate and adequate.
Adequate and accurate. And then there were three C's. What were the three C's, Darcy?
Consistent.
Consistent.
Complete.
Complete and
Concise.
concise. And after that there were no D's, no E's, no F's, no G's, no H's. There was an I. Only one I. Integrated, yeah. I, J, K, L, M, N, O. 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 Objective. Objective. And then there was a P. No, there was a P. And it wasn't probity. What was the P? Provable, yeah. Q. Then we had Romulus and Remus. R and R. Relevant and reliable. And then S. There were no S's. T's. Timely. U. And U. Understandable. Unbiased and understandable. Yep. Characteristics of good information. You were meant to be reminding me, weren't you? Or was that before break or after break? I asked you to remind me.
At the end?
Yeah, I asked you to remind me though, and I can't remember if I asked you to remind me before break or remind me after break. Okay, risk avoidance, attitude to risk. Does size matter? Does the size of the company, is that important in one's attitude to risk? Well, it does actually. It has a direct impact on us. The matter of a company's size and its attitude is not a relationship which is necessarily closely correlated. That some small companies will take big risks and some big companies will take small risks. But there are some small companies which will only take small risks and some big ones which will take enormous risks. So there's no direct correlation here that any size company can take any size risk. Individual companies in their own situation could then well disprove any generalization. For example, small companies would normally face higher risks, managed at board level. Not typically will it have the resources available to cover the risk of new product development, a heavy investment in a potential new product which is not guaranteed to be successful. That's a big risk. But on the other hand, if they don't take that risk, then demand for their existing products is eventually going to fall, and you're then into the price skimming, you're into the tail of the price skimming exercise, and they'll face lack of fashion, lack of ability to keep up, loss of market share to their competitors, which then means that we're going to have strains on our cash flow, so we can't buy materials, we'll lose our liquidity credit rating, and that will eventually lead to going concern problems, yeah. going concern problems. Probably a smaller entity will have a smaller product range, and if one product fails, then the impact on the company could be enormous. If ACCA, as John's product, if ACCA were to fail, there's nothing else. There's no fallback situation, there's no contingency plan. So the major product failure of a small company is going to be a disaster. The launch of a new product then can involve a major investment, and there's no guarantee that it will be successful. But if we're going to survive, we've got to improve, adapt, develop. I had a client who manufactured folding campers, which is a sort of cross between a tent and a caravan. And you'd tow the thing behind your car to the holiday campsite, and then you'd wind the legs down, take it off the car, obviously, unhitch it, wind the legs down, and actually you wind the legs down before you unhitched it, but it doesn't matter. And then you'd open it up and it would swing out like that and create a double bed with a tent structure above it, canvas structure above. And then you'd open that side and that would create another double bed. So you had 2 double beds, and a substantial lounge size must have been from maybe here to the wall there. And you're towing this behind your car. It's a substantial thing. It was like a house. But it folded down into just half the length. It's brilliant engineering. And they had 4 products in their range. But they were continually developing. They had their own little development area within their manufacturing place where they were continually prototyping new models, new little changes, new improvements. And when I left the UK and I had to give the audit up, they were in the final stages of developing the 5th new model in their range. And I looked them up on the website the other day, and they've now taken over one of their major competitors. The major competitor they were selling maybe half of the number of stock because the stock quality was not as good, it was not reliable, the performance was poor, it was not fashionable, people were not buying them, not interested in them. And these 2 guys, and there were only 2, and it was only a small company, 30 employees, these 2 guys have rationalised this competitor's business, and now that's blown up as well. That's phenomenal. They take a risk, but the rewards for a small company, and you have to take the risk as a small company if you want to stay in business. As a generalisation, it should be easy to see then that a small company will need to accept a certain degree of risk. Of course they do. Starting off a small company is taking a risk. What happens if it fails? What happens if people don't want your product or don't want your service? And when I left financial training, when I left FTC Kaplan all those years ago, I left on the 31st of August and I was employed again on the 1st of September, sitting at the same desk, but then I was a freelance. And that is a big risk because you have no guarantee of work, you have no holiday pay, you have no pension. It's an enormous risk. But no regrets. On the other hand, a large entity will normally face fewer risks. Why? Well, because they're a large entity. They're almost too big to fail. But we thought that about Lehman Brothers. We thought that about Arthur Andersen's. We thought that about Enron and WorldCom and Parmalat and Ahold and Polypec and Daily Mirror Group, and the list goes on. Northern Rock Building Society. The list goes on and on. Royal Bank of Scotland had to be bought out by the English government, the British government. You're too big to fail. Is your Big Four audit firm too big to fail? You would think so, but we thought that about Anderson's too. It's the same for everyone. If you get big, you get relaxed and comfortable, and I'm too big to fail. But you're not. Subdivided structure of a larger organisation allows these entities or groups to enjoy much greater diversification and thus spread the risk. More extensive product range. Diversification of markets, diversification of industry. You become a multinational conglomerate. Because you're multinational, you're not exposed to the risk of any one particular foreign unfriendly government sequestering your assets, taking your assets away, preventing you from paying dividends out of the country. Because you're multinational, you reduce the risk if one Central African Republic were to determine that all your assets now belong to the government, it's not a big deal, because we've got lots of other investments in lots of other countries around the world. A conglomerate, multinational conglomerate, involved in different things. I'm trying to remember, I think Philip Morris, the cigarette people, I think they own, do they own Kraft Foods? I think they own Kraft Foods. Yeah, I think they do. And a number of other brand names. For example, and I'm sure they don't, but for example, they may own Pirelli tyres. I'm sure they don't, but that's just as an example. But if the food market disappears, how can the food market disappear? We all stop eating. Or some other product comes, some sort of spray on butter instead of having to spread the butter with a knife. If the food market were to change like that, then it doesn't matter because we've still got these Pirelli tyres. If the tyre market were to change, we've got our new product to spray on butter. So all this diversification of geographical range, products, the markets, the target markets that we're aiming for, this reduces the risk for a big company. But you know, there's a perverse element of this. The small company has to take risks if they want to continue to grow or continue to survive. If they don't take risks, it depends then if they're in a niche market and there's nobody else doing it. Very much like this company. So it's a niche market that nobody else is doing here in this geographical area. But small companies may choose not to take risks. I'm just quite happy if I'm in a niche market, why should I take a risk? Big companies, they don't need to, or they can take risks, I should say. They can take risks because of their diversification. If something goes wrong, it doesn't matter. But equally, because they have a reputation, if something does go wrong and the media gets hold of it and the reputation, then the reputation gets blown to pieces because the media has got hold of it and starts telling the world that BP has poured all this oil into the Gulf of Mexico. What happened to BP's reputation? What happened to its share price? What happened to its ability to raise finance by way of loan when its market capitalization plunged through the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico? So they can't borrow money to repay their existing debt. So because they can't borrow money, their credit rating goes down. So credit rating goes down, then they can't pay the suppliers. Ultimately, what's going to happen? We're going to have going concern problems, yeah. So big companies may choose actively to avoid risk, to avoid putting themselves into a situation where their reputation could suffer, because one of their biggest unrecognized assets is their reputation.